want to, I want to actually take a minute, if you don't mind, just a minute.
Oh, this is.
To begin by once more, and hopefully not for the final time, but once more, I want to thank Don. I think everybody. Some of you who are here, many of you who are here, don't know actually how difficult this particular set of arrangements has been, in part because we've had some chaos on our side in the preparation of things, and Don has handled it all with great generosity. And I was just saying to him that this is a very busy time for him, and he hasn't been with us all the time, and that's been our loss. But I wanted to say that I just thanked him for having done such a fine job so that we could conduct ourselves happily, even in his absence at times.
It's been my pleasure.
I also want to thank all of you who've come, because despite Dartmouth's grace and charm, it's not the easiest spot to reach. Which is why it's so graceful and charming. But I want to thank you all for coming. That's very important. It helps me to believe that we're doing something. I want to thank those people who are here for, if not the first time, but only the second or third time. It's good to see folks continuing to join in our conversations. And I hope we will continue to go forward with these meetings. And then also, some of you know that I've been dealing with a family tragedy in the last few days, so I've been scooting in and out. And I apologize for the disruptions, and I apologize for seeming less attentive and participating less than I might have ordinarily. Stathis Gourgouris has hurtled himself off to Greece because, as Bruce said to me, Stathis really needed to be in Greece. So we let him go on this occasion. But fortunately, Hortense Spillars, who you all know, and was at Vanderbilt, and Don, who of course you all know, was at Dartmouth, have agreed to carry a kind of summary discussion. So I'm just going to turn it over to you. Okay, thank you.
Okay, we're going to try to summarize things. We don't know how this is going to go, right? We've had no dress rehearsal. So we'll just see how it goes. I want to start because I want Don to bring us home as usual. My remarks are sort of stream of consciousness because I've tried to reflect on all of the talks that I have heard, starting with Charles's talk that's really been haunting me, and I kept hearing echoes of his talk in all the presentations that we've had since that time. And oddly enough, or interestingly enough, the idea to start this with some consideration of what must be a red letter year for the historiography of someone like Césaire. And as a matter of fact, Tony mentioned it in his talk, 1492, which we know, according to some thinkers, as the year of the other. I think it's Antonio Nebrija's 1492 is the year of the other. It's the expulsion of Jewish communities from the Iberian Peninsula. It's the first year of a Spanish grammar, as well as the year of the European breach of what we will come to know as the Americas, and the discoveries that demarcated, that will have fatal implications for autochthonous peoples of the New World and the whole of the African continent, and particularly the sub-Saharan continent. So I suppose the whole process of thinkification that Tony was talking about this morning might be tracked back to 1492, if not so much as a year, as a symbol, right? And a kind of breach or break. So I think of that, and also Caliban's reasoning that might also be tracked back to 1492. So how do we bring all these elements together? And I think that's where bent studies comes in, if I have understood bent studies. And I probably haven't given the subtitle, but I've used it in the way that I want to think about it, and that is as an episteme or an epistemology that is based on paradox, with an emphasis on poesis or making. So bent studies, which I think would be comfortable with Kenneth Burke, to go back to something I think Colin was talking about earlier today, which would take Kenneth Burke as one of its intellectual heroes, generates instances, and I heard all of this in Charles's talk, instances of inversion, reversal, collocation, paranomasia, catachresis, double supply. If I give you a bowl, you can have soup, but if I teach you to bowl, right? Okay. So I think of that as the pitch of poetry, as a heuristic register, as a movable feast that teaches again the commitment to reading, to language as our greatest puzzle and reward. It is to be entangled in the flesh of the world, and we get a kind of entanglement in the flesh of the world in something like Césaire's Return to My Native Land. And in that case, poesis and politics come together, or labor, work, and poesis come together. If Tony were here, I guess I would ask him to explain why he thinks that Arendt's work, labor, is opposed to poesis, because as I hear it, they really come together. Performativity is activity, which is also naming, and when you bring that together, you have one of a number of traditions of thinking and writing, and one of them is Black radical tradition. I think of the work of W.E.B. Du Bois in connection with that work, C.L.R. James, Richard Wright, Frantz Fanon, and they were all makers in the sense that for them poesis and politics were not separate activities, but they were both kinds of performativity or activity. And then the last thing I would say, and I want somebody to tell me exactly where this is from. I'm remembering it from Coleridge's Biographia Literaria, to go back to a text that Jonathan alluded to earlier. I think what Charles was talking about might be comparable to the poet and the esemplastic powers. Is that in Biographia Literaria, or bringing disparate things to harmony? And I think that's the academy that we all missed, or the one that we all would like to teach in. What we're trying to make the humanities academy. I think that's probably been our general mission all these decades, to make it a place where paradox comes home. Whether or not we're comfortable in it is another question. We probably aren't, but a place where paradox, if it cannot be made safe, at least possible. And that's what I heard in this talk, that all the talks that we heard, for their amazing diversity, all seem to come back to that question of taking disparate materials and making them work together, raising questions that are impossible to perhaps formulate, say nothing of answer, and for that reason must be answered more urgently than all of them, right? And so
Well, the pitch of paradox, handing over the baton, is a noble effort at socializing poetic language. I too want to begin with Charles, and the disparity between the conversations that emerged after Charles' performance of the talk and the construction of that performance is itself a kind of iconic performative. That at the same time as it showed how, through the intertextual relations you adduced among 19th century American poets through 20th century midrashic commentators and non-midrashic commentators, you developed what I would call a social life in reserve that was asking to be elaborated in the conversations that followed. So for me, then the next paper, and that's in which a particular problem was brought forward. How do you understand a poet who is transforming into what was agreed to be described as a vernacular, a certain Quranic inflection, produced a whole series of responses across a range of registers, thereby demonstrating how the activity of producing a poetic act following the Bandung Conference necessitated a whole set of what you would describe as paradoxical, ambivalent responses that are themselves part of the social life of poetry, understood as that which refuses professional lines. What I understood by Bent studies, or one of the key inflections of Bent studies, is that it was resisting efforts to professionalize the teaching of literature or the teaching of poetry. And it was doing so by producing a kind of wonderful conjunction between a stand-up Catskill performer and a powerful poetic voice that were simultaneously soliciting response, but also respecting the performance as separable from conversation. So I felt that the conversation that emerged following Charles' presentation was itself an effort to turn into the lively sensibility of joined conviviality, what was put into poetic reserve and then brought out of reserve into let's call it social life forming potentiality of poetry. And the talks that emerged from this morning into the last of the talks this afternoon, it seemed to me, all enriched that reserve by tapping different aspects of it. I too heard Tony's talk as a way of returning to a moment of epistemic break in which everything had to be at once reimagined and rethought as a kind of mythopoesis, but a mythopoesis of the flesh that had been abandoned, refused representation within, say, Michelangelo's version of this. I heard in Tony's talk as a resonance the flesh becoming person, what was represented as lacking after man becoming human, after the separations, after the thingification that happens at that epistemic break that you're associating with 1492. I heard as what was getting vocalized in his insistence on the term making, as opposed to either labor or action, a certain entry into mythopoesis of his reading, powerful reading, of the visual poetics of Césaire. And I also then heard in Colin Diane's talk an inflection of a different dimension of the poetic reserve, a redefinition of sensibility, poetic sensibility, around a betweenness that preceded the formation of disparate voices or different personalities. I heard in the description of the intermediate, in the interstitial, in the betweenness, a sense of an affect that almost precedes linguistic or cognitive representation, but is nevertheless its precondition, as if poetry were becoming the means whereby something that had been forgotten in the usual representations of the resources of poetry was getting sourced again, as if a pool of empathy that is the locus for all forms of poetic pathos had suddenly been renewed, recovered. You were bathing us in it. You referred to it as animality, but I felt it as a sensation of affect that is almost a precondition for speech and feeling as such. And I heard in Christian's wonderful recounting of what's missing from present day understandings of transatlantic history. I wish at once to ask for a, let's call it vigilance, discovering missing forms, a novel that would account for the effect of the American Revolution or the British on either side of the water, and a retrieval of a missed resonance, of a missed social life in a poetic genre that had been either forgotten or displaced by both literary history and materialist history. The Georgic's miniaturization, its reduction of epic to a pitch, not in the sense of a stain, but in the sense of an inflection that required some, again, vigilant attention in order to render animate. And that's what I really liked about the movement of the kind of, although it wasn't, I'm sure, the selection principle for the order of the speakers, when Jonathan turned to the key term of spirit in order to redescribe Wordsworth's poetic diction as necessary to the sense of what poetry does for an entire social order, what poetry does as a social formation in and of itself and as a means of producing, sustaining, invigorating, animating social formations. I thought that had a kind of wonderful, for me, bookend effect in its relation to Charles Bernstein's pataquarical interrogation. And then finally, I thought that although Bruce Robbins said that he had missed the required genre poetry, nevertheless, I felt that he was unlocking a key dimension of the social life in poetry by returning us to a foundational violence. That poetry in the Episteme of 1492, but poetry also in the pitch of its passion, always already acknowledges and averts acknowledgement from. And I thought that too, insofar as it solicited the deep empathy in her response of Colin Diane, who has been in relation to that question for me more rigorously and movingly than what I know, was also bringing into the social life of our discussion the significance of poetry as a means of sustaining, animating, developing social life, but also transforming it.
And Colin's piece is also a way to talk about ways of being touched.
Ways of being
in
touched.
The haptic, of the sense that we know less about than the others, right, is that one. And maybe the whole question, difficult question about animality is a way of raising.
Touch, the contact.
Yeah,
That
touch. I got that
it's not
in the narrative.
literal.
When Stella went up to the man, and there was nothing said, but there was a whole thing said. When the man recognized what the animal was doing and recognized something in him, right? And so that whole exchange proceeds by a kind of contact zone,
Yeah.
right? Yeah,
When you
across species. Yeah.
You said that it drew out of that man something that you had not heard. It was kind of folk wisdom. She's doing that because she knows I'm sick.
Yeah.
She's doing that because she knows I'm sick. And then to have him also then say that I'm going to die.
And she knows it.
And she knows it. That too is a deep patriarchal, but that is operating at a level of empathy that is almost before words.
Mm.
And it is touch. It is touch. It's the haptic uptake of that. And you could feel in the room the kind of hapticity, if that's a word, following that.
I mean, the question would be then, is there, you see, can one, without falling into a kind of trivial idea, oh, how cute, or oh, the animal, somehow to plug into what you call that circuit of empathy, which joins you in spite of yourself to something that you did not choose to be part of. There is another kind of politics.
And it's where you refuse to be simply a medium, or a medium who is distanced from it. And you let the whole communication circuit, you feel the whole circuit of communication. It's a communication that's so deep that it is, that speech almost violates it unless it is as close to it as the feeling of that haptic.
Because it overcomes distance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But now, I mean, it was the felt power of the reported words of the man that gave that account its full force.
Whether it was the words or the words were themselves punctuations of a felt interiority, there's something about the haptic that's almost like hearing. You know, where hearing produces this sense of an interiority that you share, that is before separation and kind of violates the conditions of separation. The haptic is almost like the externalization of hearing, where hearing has itself pulled everything into its circuitry. It's the externalization of the interiority that we usually associate with hearing.
Right. Well, when I thought about flesh some time ago, when I was thinking about with captive populations is the extent to which they are immediately available.
Yeah. We call it. You call it the captive body.
Yeah. And that immediacy of availableness is what touching is about, right?
Yes, that's wonderful. Yeah.
And so it's the first thing that determines whether or not one has the right to call oneself sovereign, is the extent to which I need your permission to touch you, right? Yeah. But the power to touch is to be immediately captivated or not captivated. And that's why I think the haptic is so powerful a sense in that case.
So
think
you're
it's
saying that the
analogous.
touching is almost, insofar as no one said, can't say, I don't want to be touched by that. I don't want to be touched. I don't want to feel that. I don't want to be, that you're touched almost before you have any say in being touched. And that too produces this circuitry.
It's no distance.
There's no
right,
distance,
it's no
but it's not
distance, yeah.
felt as captive. What's strange about it is that it's almost simultaneously a release from feeling captivated by your body. There's a prior captivity of being in a body at all,
Okay.
and somehow being in a communal body, a flesh that is the betweenness of embodied flesh. I mean, there's a flesh of the world, and that Merleau-Ponty talks about so wonderfully in the chiasm of betweenness, that empathy seems to animate, and it operates according to a different logic from the juridical logic associated with, bodies not wanting to be violated or touched.
Exactly.
It's
operates-
almost as if we're in a different. It's not that we're out of body, but we're in the flesh of the world, and we're in a different
Vulnerable.
relation to corporeality in the movement of that empathy. And when you talk about it's learning from animals, the sense that animals have, that the world is not separable from the movement of an animal across. When I'm trying to figure out my dog's relation to movement, very different relation to movement, and to try to figure out the enjoyment he experiences in just moving, and it is an ambience of where he's not restricted to what you usually understand as a particularized embodiment. It's as if it's violated the lineaments of what Blake would call the particularized lineaments of it, and you're instead in the glad day.
This is Fred Newton's In the Break.
Yes. It's Fred Moten's In the Break, exactly. Yes.
I'm something of a literalist, so I'm still trying to parse this. In the recounted incident, the only creatures touching are the man and the dog. And Colin, we were wondering whether there's new politics we might ratchet down a little bit and ask for a new practice. There's still separation, right? There's separation between you as witness, and then there's a second separation when you recount that to us. If we make the haptic a priority, I imagine what we're being asked, the right thing to do would have been to complete the circle, grab the dog's paw, grab the man's hand.
But that's the point, no.
Okay, but what?
Because
why
it's not the right
not?
thing to do. It's not about what is right or what is wrong.
Yeah.
It's carrying, I think, that moment, which is probably, it is not something empirical,
Yeah.
or something that can be, well, we're all going to join hands now and sing together the joy of the cosmos.
To join,
This is because I don't think we can. This is the question I was asking.
Yeah.
Is there a politics here? I don't think you can take that moment and then discuss, well, how does this then become enacted as politics? What I'm raising instead is a position in the world that would make a politics possible, that didn't have to ask, what then? Do we join hands? Because I do think that if one could forget the distinctions of status or taste in that moment, the divisions, and somehow be in the break or in between, if you can follow what I'm saying, there is a change that takes place in your relationship to what is around you. It is a change, and that in itself is a movement. Do you see what I'm saying? It's a movement away from division, either or or it's to be hoped that it would be. And you're quite right about the juridical, because Milton used to always say to me, no, this juridical, it is not the only way. And he was always trying to talk about the resistance that lay in the not juridical, in the, and then in the break gets to that, and I think that's why there are places like music or poetry or dance where you are in a circuit that is very political and activist place that is not easily translated into what we usually think about as a political argument. So that's the difficulty there.
Though I think the juridical term that Christian used, witness, is a term that can undergo itself a transformation. Because a percipient witness at a trial is a figure who's involved in an already established set of events. But when someone asks you to bear witness to, or assumes you could bear witness to a trauma, someone is sharing with you some terrible, shocking event, such that when you're listening, you're literally undergoing for the person who's undergone the horrible event the capacity to experience it for the person who cannot experience it. And it produces, that witnessing can itself produce, I think, an alternative valence of relationality that Levinas begins to talk about when he talks about infinite responsibility, where the responding precedes an ego, where the capacity to respond fully is what has precedence over being an I that is separable from the activity of responding, which is itself creating a call-response circuitry. It's that whole sense of interconnectedness that emerges through the sound of a call to hear is itself, I think, an obligation to empathy that has a political balance to it.
Also, what it means is to pick up on the captive. The captive. I don't want to be captivated, but then you are captured. You see, there's something in the captive and captivation here as well that is very useful, it seems to me, to think through. Which is empathy. It's along the grid of empathy. It's not. It's a different kind, as I was saying before, of cognition.
Oh, it is a cognition. Yeah.
No, but then thinking about the having to think about the captive led me to think about touch in a different way, and that's because I regard touch as a resource, right? And so not being captive is exactly what I would want to talk about, but having to think about captivity led me to think about touch, right? The haptic in that sense, because it seemed to me that that's what captivity was more precisely than anything else, the ability to put hands on, whether one wanted it or not, was the essence of that situation.
But if you bring that forward and we start thinking about that, then aren't some of us at least tempted to make a priority out of corporeal sovereignty, such that we wouldn't want to be captivated, we wouldn't want empathy to come on us unawares, we wouldn't want to be able to feel something unrefusable in the face of the dog and the man. if that replicates the condition of captivity whose historical coordinates we've just beginning to describe.
Well, what I'm saying is that, well, no, you would want to be rid of the situation of captivity, in which case the haptic is then associated with erotic possibility.
Excuse me.
Sneezing on the truth.
It's haptic.
Interpenetration both ways. I've noticed this right now, slouching.
And so a terminological question that other people may have thought about and would interest me, it just emerged in the play among the comments here. Do we understand what the relation is between liberation and deliberation?
You want to?
Well, I mean, I think this was triggered by.
I think it's a pun rather than an etymological.
Well, I mean, the words are absolutely related. There's no doubt about that. It's not a bringing together of things that are forms that mimic each other without any rooted connection. But it was the remark on the thought that Colin put forward on a politics where you don't have to ask what then. And I thought, well, so one wants a politics without deliberation. And then I thought, oh, well, is that then what, is that a liberation of politics without deliberation? I do not have a view on this except to say I think probably a politics with no deliberation isn't a good idea, but that doesn't mean that there is no room for a politics where you don't ask what then, but they somehow occupy different spaces and times.
But you don't have to turn that into an either or unless you want to make a kind of joke out of proposing that there can be moments in which you decide to suspend deliberative judgment or deliberative activity. It isn't. I mean, what I'm hearing is, there's a savvy in empathy that I think that Colin is suggesting when she
Attacked in the haptic.
associates it with cognition. But cognition, think about what you said earlier, Jonathan, about a moment in which a word, spirit, that in a keyword you had all kinds of, you had a series of deliberations that allowed you to feel as if cognitively you had exhausted your understanding of the matter. And then you heard in Rachel Furlow's dissertation defense an expression that caused you said, to be pulled back cognitively. You said, now that's where the haptic can take you up, even at the level of cognition, so that what you would usually understand to be in deliberative reasoning, utterly non-commensurable activities that we use deliberative judgment to keep separate, suddenly surprised you. You were surprised by the hapticity of your own cognitive process. So what I think is being suggested here is not as soon as you use terms such as betweenness or the interstitial or in the break, you're not talking about means whereby you establish separations. You're talking about what, because it happens in between, usually bypasses reasoning or even bypasses attention. If you can suddenly become attentive to what's between thoughts, usually we have to have a thought of a thought in order, but what if you are focused, sufficiently focused, to be aware of what takes place between thoughts, which is awareness without an object, feeling without a specific trigger for the feeling. Feeling as such, the infinity of feeling as such. It seems to me that that would be a way of locating what otherwise sounds like a kind of ineffable mode of speculation, hence distrusted, hence what I'm hearing in this conversation is an empathy that not only refers to relations with beings with whom we otherwise understand ourselves to be in non-pathic relations, but also empathy with our own already established processes of thinking, feeling, judging, to be empathic with all of our processes of human form of life is also necessarily giving access to what is called animality, access to all forms, all of the resources of life is also access to animality. And I don't hear that as an either or.
It's a kind of porosity, isn't it?
It's a
This
ferocity.
we're talking about. Porousness, right?
I'm going to try to do something which I ordinarily don't do, I'm against, which is to ventriloquize someone who is absent. I think Stathis, having written the book, Does Literature Think?, would object at this point to the desperate, maybe I'm putting words in his mouth, but the desperate, really putting words in, urge to value that which is in between thoughts at the expense of the thoughts. I would call it desperate, he very likely would not, because it assumes exactly that what we ordinarily mean by thinking is really a kind of a contemptible kind of activity, which is not already infused with feeling and imagination and inspiration and so on and so forth. I'm saying what it sounds like.
Okay, so let me respond to what it sounds like by looking at the form in which you produced the sound as an interrogative. In order to ask, when you ask the question, does literature think? As soon as you position yourself as a questioner, you're already assuming that literature does other things besides thinking. It does not thereby preclude thinking. The asking of the question is producing a relation between literature and the questioner that, insofar as the interrogative is doing its performative work, necessarily sustains a distinction between the question, does literature think, and the figure asking the question, who wouldn't ask the question if it were already answered. Literature is doing many things, including thinking.
Bruce, let me just also interject here. Maybe it's something closer to, thought thinking itself through in the Mallarméan sense, which is a terrifically embodied process, but it doesn't mean that you are against thought, thinking. To be in between thinking is just another stage or another spot, another place in something that is taking place and is that you want to continue taking place, but it's I don't intend it to be.
That doesn't seem to me an accurate description of the way the conversation has gone.
It does not.
No,
but
not to me. It seems to me that there has been a desire to celebrate that other thing.
Well, it's so easy to want to celebrate something these days.
Well,
Why not celebrate it? So what?
Okay.
So we celebrate it, and do you think then that is the entirety of the conversation? You have selected a certain moment in the social life of poetic language. Many forms of socialism, many descriptions of the social life of poetic languages have been offered, including an iconic performative, which does not presuppose any kind of in-betweenness, any kind of necessary empathic relation. It's soliciting a different activity of consciousness. Why would you select this particular set of observations to describe the entirety of the conversation and say you're suddenly distrustful of what's taking place.
I didn't do that, but I am doing what I think a roundtable is supposed to do, which is to summarize impressions of a number of different things. And I so summarize, right, by saying that there has been, to me, a somewhat desperate reaching out to value very highly that which is in between thoughts.
If it is solicited from you the notion desperate, I'm wondering about the state of mind that has produced that said adjective. I don't hear desperation anywhere. But
Well,
maybe that's
I
me.
mean-
But also relaxing.
Let's have one person at a time, can we? Yes, Colin, sorry.
Yeah, I was saying the use of the verb latching itself betrays a certain attention to something that was not at all what was being floated here. So it's interesting that you would use that verb, latching on, desperately. But let me interject here something that we could maybe think about, which is kind of leaving your point just for a moment and going back to your idea of spirit. I think that Calvin, unfortunately, might give us a place to stand where we might be able to see something of what Donald and Hortense have just been kind of
Desperately.
desperately
I am a desperado. I am
and that is when he says in the Institutes, he takes Luke, the passage, see and touch, for a spirit has no flesh and bones. And then Calvin's gloss is, will not a new definition of the body have to be coined? I think that what is being spoken about is that interrupt. That might sound like desperation to you, being put in the place where suddenly an observation, somebody telling you see and touch, a spirit has no flesh and bone, leaves you only with, must not a new definition of the body. That might seem like desperation. However, to me, it seems like an opening into another possibility of epistemology.
Okay, let me go back.
That's what we're trying to describe.
So-
Possibilities.
What's it?
That's what we're trying to do, is open something, not close something,
So
or
what
be
Christian-
definitive, or, yeah.
Well, Christian was asking you about your story about Stella and the guy in the car. As I understood him, he was saying, look, this is all about words. It's about the words that the guy in the car spoke, and it's about your reporting of the words. And this is about poetry. Poetry is words. So I would be happy to draw my line and, on words.
Wow.
That I don't think it's about bodies. I mean, we would really be joining hands and singing or something if it was about bodies. It's about words. So let's talk about words.
Okay, so let's talk about words in the way they mean nomo. I mean, thinking about, again, someone who was working on African-based religions for a very long time, words are not always exclusive of body, of other means of contagion that they have. The power, the force of a word, of a name, extends into other places. So that I don't think I don't see the delimitation that you're seeing here. I can't disagree with you see, in what you're saying. I do think, however, that there was much more going on there than the words. There's a lot more. And I guess that's the importance, is what is sounded out and what is not spoken. And that's why I began with the poetry that I did, particularly the Berriman, because I think that he captures what can't finally, or shouldn't finally, be captured in words. Although he's writing words, yes. But, I mean, we are all doing that.
This shouldn't be a conversation between you and me. I have to
Oh,
say,
but
I was thinking as much of Tony's talk, for and the importance that he gave to flesh as opposed to word, which, kind of lost me a little. To be honest, I didn't quite get why the so much attention to the flesh as opposed to the word. And I'm sure there are reasons for this. But I was putting things together as one is supposed to do in a final roundtable, and to think, why are people so, lacking in confidence in what words can do, that they're rushing toward the flesh?
We are rushing toward the flesh, and I can admit why, that maybe I rush toward the flesh. It is that at a very early age, having been brought up in a very oppressive Atlanta, I discovered in college, of all people to be talking about now, Jan Heitzjan. Muntu.
Mhm.
I remember that.
Do you remember Muntu?
I sure do.
I think that it, unfortunately, part of Muntu, or the life force, is the flesh beyond the word. And the way, I really would love to go back to Jan now and see how he defines the word. Because I think it takes us back to something of what Tony was getting at. The avoidance of the word, knowing that there is no real avoidance, that you're in it. However, there is a beyond that reaches somewhere else. And it goes into a kind of, it does sound, but it's not joining hands. I tell you, this life, this Muntu, this life force, this Nomo, but it is another way of being in the world. That's all, one might say.
I had to walk out on Tony's talk. But I gather he spoke of Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel.
You did mention that.
Yeah, one thing we would say about why you would speak of flesh is because, unlike Raphael or Leonardo, indeed in warlike opposition to that tradition, Michelangelo believed that the highest achievement of art was the sculpture of the body, which he spent a lot of time opening and anatomizing, and spent even more time attempting to reproduce in monumental form in stone, even in architectural form. And on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel and elsewhere, but primarily there, his effort, we might say contra Leonardo, is to try to test the limits of how the volumetrics, the Cézanne-like quality to this, the volumetrics of bodily form can occupy a planar space of painting. It's not really a problem of Renaissance perspective at all. That's not an issue there. But that's also an allegorical text because it's a recasting of a biblical moment. So the touching of fingers, which I did hear Tony say something about, the touching of fingers is a perfect instantiation of the anagogic vision of John's gospel.
Right, well, that's what he mentioned.
Yeah, okay, right. So the compulsion, but the compulsion of body is evident as a matter of polemic. But
Except the fingers don't touch.
they don't touch.
And there's a
but
synaptic
finish
gap.
Finish the story, which is that no one has mentioned in this context that Leonardo had another great skill and talent, and that was as a poet and as a great writer of letters, of course, as we know.
Michelangelo.
Sorry, what did I say?
You were speaking
I
for-
misspoke, not Leonardo. Leonardo wrote well too, of course. Michelangelo's sonnets, which Britain and others have set to music. So the interesting thing there for me is the inescapable or undesirability of, in Michelangelo's life, breaking these kinds of bounds at all. He saw nothing to suggest the inimicability of the poetic, the bodily, the verbal, and so on. Now we know that that's the kind of global classical Renaissance humanism people have come to dislike, but it was a compound achievement that seemed to me was somewhere in back of Tony's argument. But it's not, I think, at all what you all are talking about when we speak of the body.
Words themselves can bring body, a pun. And
Well, that's where
the key.
this whole discussion started.
Exactly,
About its
exactly.
paradoxes in language, right?
Right.
started there.
And Kenneth Burke, who has been one of the figures who's functioned as a kind of refrain, has a theory about punning, with like where he would turn beauty is truth, truth beauty, into body is turd, turd body, in order to demonstrate the impossibility of insisting upon the separation of words.
See, I don't think that's clever.
I do.
I think that's actually obvious. It's so not clever.
Well, then if you don't think it's clever, then you get the pun, which means you are ready to sneeze again.
Well, that may be, but that's just, again, interpenetration both ways. Right.
Which means you're bodied.
Yeah, of course. But not clever. Not insightful.
I think you're desperation.
Not me. I'm at peace with the world. As a classical hymnist, I'm at peace with the world.
So a weird thing I've noticed in moments of graduate recruitment is that people in my department are ready to elevate applicants who have done dance, music, visual arts over more qualified people because they have an envy of the tactile or of the others, appeal to the other senses.
That is
and
fascinating. You noticed that?
I've noticed this over years now.
That does
That
not happen.
people will get
Doesn't happen in
taken.
Dartmouth.
Doesn't happen at Penn.
Well, okay,
Doesn't happen
you know,
in Penn.
I'm
We
I'm
gotta
really
get
happy
your
to hear
admissions
it.
I
committee
think
to
you're just being clever, Bruce.
I'm happy, I'm really happy to hear it, because I thought, don't we believe in our medium anymore? We need some kind of affirmation from the media that have to do with the world of sensation, which, Lord knows, is part of the context of any discussion of poetry, given that we know that our students, of course, are moving in a world of the visual and the nonverbal, and whatever we do is always implicitly in a context of all of that. So, I mean, I suppose this is trying to explain a little bit of the extra emotion that may have gone into this word desperate.
I get it. Okay. It's all Colombian.
That's a wrong
Visions of Colombia. Yes.
I think that brings us to terminus ad quem. Thank you all very much. I hope to see you and more in November in Pittsburgh, when we will have the pleasant topic of the militarization of knowledge on the table.
Thank you, Paul, for organizing.